Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It is with this phrase that Muslims begin every activity in life. It means, in the name of God, the most merciful, the all good, or the compassionate. And it would not be possible to begin a lecture on God Himself without this refrain, and also because this explains, I think, profoundly the attitude towards God in the Islamic tradition from which I hail. The word for mercy and compassion, or all goodness, in this formula which I just uttered for you, in Arabic is Ar-Rahman and Rahim, and as in Hebrew, it is related to the root for the womb, for Rahim in Arabic. These two languages, being sister languages belonging to the Semitic family, oftentimes have roots which are very similar to each other. And it means that really it is from the womb of mercy that we are born, that everything must begin with that. And when we begin with the name of God, we also begin with the name of His mercy, without which there would be no world. Now, I was born and brought up in a Muslim family in Persia and Iran, from which I originally come, in which the reality of Islam was extremely strong, in which the dimension of transcendence was to be seen everywhere, in which the rites to which Diana Eck, my friend, referred to yesterday in her description of the mosque in Boston, was part and parcel of our daily life. But moreover, my family, besides being family of famous scholars, were also, especially my father, devoted to Sufism. That is, the inner mystical dimension of Islam, which has been somewhat denatured and denuded in its present-day presentation in certain circles, especially in the western part of the United States, but which really belongs to the heart of the Islamic tradition and not to be seen otherwise. I remember I was only 4 or 5 years old when my father taught me poems of Hafiz and Rumi, which spoke about what we call today religious dialogue, or the universality of revelation across borders and across various humanities. I will just cite for you one poem. Being a Persian, you will allow me to cite one Persian poem, which I learned when I was only 4 or 5 years old, by the divine poet Hafiz, whom I consider to be the greatest of all Persian poets, who said that ishq بین دیر و خرابات فرق نیست هر جا که هست پرتوی روی حبیب هست. Of course, it's not translatable, but I would translate it with a broken translation. In love, there is no difference between the monastery and the temple of the Magi. It is a Zoroastrian temple. Wherever there is anything, there is the light of the face of the beloved. I was brought up in this tradition, and I've never left it. An intimacy was created within me for the divine reality at that very young age. A reality which was at once all-encompassing, all-caring, but also awesome. The element of the tremendum, of the majesty of the divine, which Islam emphasizes so much, was also very much present, but combined with love. There are verses of the Quran, the sacred scripture of Islam, which speak of God as the utterly other, the transcendent, the beyond, that which has no like. And Islam, like Judaism, emphasizes above everything the oneness of God. But there are other verses which, of course, speak of the intimacy of God with us, of His being closer to us than our jugular vein, of wherever you turn, there is the face of God, the famous verse of the Quran, and many others. And the journey of the human soul towards God, in a sense, oscillates between these two poles. Without this oscillation, there is no journeying. It's not possible to accept only one pole without the other. The two are necessary in order for us to realize the divine origin of our own existence and smell something of the perfume of the divine reality. When I was young, I was sent to the West to continue my studies. Before going to MIT, I was sent to a prep school in New Jersey, which was Baptist. And for several years, I went to church every Sunday. Probably I've gone to church more than many people in this audience. I hope not. I hope not, but I think that is perhaps the case. At least in some audiences. These years were very meaningful to me in the sense that the love which Islam inculcates in the hearts of its believers for Christ was, in a sense, augmented. That flame became stronger, and I've always, of course, nurtured in my heart a very great love for Christ, not as the Son. Of course, Islam does not accept the aspect of incarnation, but as the manifestation of God and the greatest prophet before the prophet of Islam. But also it was during my years at Petty that, fortunately, unfortunately, the gifts which God had given me in the field of science and mathematics became manifest, and I received the highest grade anybody had ever received from the Princeton Center for a test that they given on mathematics in the field of mathematics. And so everybody thought I should be a scientist. And I recall that I went to MIT with the joy of trying to discover in physics the reality of things. It took me 30 years later to read that Parmenides, when he was young, the person who is considered to be the founder of Western philosophy, had said that he wanted to be a physicos. A physicos is a person who sought to understand the nature of things. But while a sophomore, only a short while at MIT, I discovered that, in fact, physics does not lead to that discovery of the nature of things at all. And it was, as I've said in my autobiography somewhere, that it was Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher, who once speaking in Cambridge, in a sense gave the coup de grace to this view of things by saying that, in fact, physics only leads to certain mathematical structures concerning the nature of reality, but not to reality itself. And after that very lecture, I decided to leave the field of science once and for all. But I stuck it out. I stuck it out for several years. I got my degree in physics and mathematics. Later on, I went to Harvard and studied geology and geophysics before turning to philosophy and the history of science. But the die was cast at that time. I received, of course, a very strong challenge from the whole climate of agnosticism and atheism at that time. And being the type of person I was, I could not leave these things alone. For several years, I studied Kant and Hegel and Descartes and Hume and more contemporary philosophy. That, of course, shook my intellectual world. But it did not shake my faith in God, that inner relationship that had been created. But it also brought about a major crisis, and I was one of the very first Orientals to face the crisis of modernism without succumbing to it. My response was really a rejection of the whole adventure of Renaissance humanism and the Enlightenment project. And my life has been dedicated, in fact, to providing an answer to all the queries posed by that rejection that came with the cutting of the Gordian knot between human reason and what St. Thomas Aquinas called the intellect, which can know in the principial sense, and also the centralization of the human being as being the center of all values, the anthropocentrism, which is also extremely central to modern science, in contrast to what people say. Because everything that modern science knows is through our senses and our reason. So it's a very human way of knowing. No matter how many zeros we add to the distance of galaxies and so forth, has nothing to do with it. The subject which knows is no more than the human. And therefore, it was against that perspective that I set out. And it was at that time in my life that I discovered the writings of the traditional authors, especially of Guénon, Coomaraswamy, and Chuan, which led me to two very, very important goals in my life. One was the opening study of the door of the non-Islamic, at the same time non-Christian traditions. Ananda Coomaraswamy was perhaps the greatest expositor of Hinduism and Buddhism in this country in the first part of the 20th century. And I gained access to his library, and for years and years I just read and read and read about Hinduism and Buddhism, although this was not my field. I took all the courses at Harvard in history of Hindu art and Buddhist art, and in Hinduism and Buddhism. I met everybody who came at that time to Cambridge, from Suzuki down. And this had a very important effect upon, in a sense, reconfirming what I had known as a child. That is, the face of God shines everywhere. Wherever I went, where there was a philosophy which was based upon the divine reality, I felt at home. And I came soon to realize that my home is wherever the divine resides, whatever language he might have chosen to have spoken in. And the second important lesson that I learned was what we call the philosophia perennis, the perennial philosophy, which in fact these great giants of the early 20th century and later part of the 20th century espoused, and which has been my own philosophy. That is the philosophy that claims that in the heart of all authentic religions and philosophies, there is in fact an abiding single truth, and in which all expressions of that truth are like so many languages of a single truth, without this in any way negating the differences, to which I shall come in a moment. This, of course, is not a lecture on comparative religion, but on God, but nevertheless one is forced to speak also of this point, that is how other views of God affect our own. At that time also began something which is very intimate and personal, about which I never speak, but to be honest, one has to say something about it. My own active quest after God in an active spiritual path connected with Sufism, with which I've been concerned all of my life. All of my life has been a search for God. And therefore, everything else I do, everything else I've done, whether writing, running universities, establishing academies, whatever I've done in my life, the heart of it has always been the quest for the divine. What I have to say to you today is briefly the result, you might say, of these many years of quest. And the result, of course, is always from divine grace, and not only the energy that God has given to walk upon the path. But before doing that, let's remember the famous Taoist saying, which says, "Those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know." What in the world are we speaking about? Of course, what he's referring to, this great saying, wonderful saying, is the ineffability of the divine reality, to which Rabbi Kushner and others also referred yesterday. That is, all that we say about God is really nothing compared to all that we cannot say about Him. And so it's really the tip of the iceberg. The most eloquent discourse about God is ultimately silence. And I want to tell you the story, just one story I will tell, because so many beautiful stories were told by those who spoke before me. In the early 70s, I went to India for, I don't know, nth time. I was then living in Iran and Persia, we were neighbors, I would go often. And at that time, arrangements were made for me to meet the supreme successor of the great Shankaracharya of Kanchipuram, the great Shankaracharya of 9th century, called the Shankaracharya of Kanchipuram near Madras. He was a venerable sage, very old at that time. You know, he would walk with his retinue and on elephants, and so was like a king. And he gave me an appointment. And I was taken to an orchard, a beautiful orchard, outside of Madras, about an hour away. There was a very beautiful Persian carpet. He knew I was a Persian, sat down on the ground for me. And I was wearing traditional Islamic dress. I was not wearing Western dress at that time. And so I sat cross-legged on this carpet waiting for this great master to come. It took about 10-15 minutes. And the Venerable Shankaracharya came in holding the staff of the sannyasin, which never touches the ground. And he was then observing a fast of silence. And at the same time, since I was an untouchable, he could not get very close to me. So he sat down without his bottom touching the ground. You know, the way that people in the East can sit down like that for 5 hours waiting for a bus. We couldn't do it for 10 seconds. And he sat down like that, holding his staff. And about the distance of the first row of the audience with me right now. And we looked at each other in the eye. He said absolutely nothing. This lasted about 3-4 minutes. And then with sign language, he pointed to someone who came, and he explained to him, he said, "Tell this Persian friend, I'm so glad that the conception of God in the Advaita and in Sufism are identical." That is discourse about God. And I felt exactly the same way. And in fact, that's the most profound religious dialogue I've ever had in my life. I have had dialogue with Hans Kung, John Hick, many famous Christians, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, authors, scholars all over the world, but that was the most profound. And I say the story to you now because those who claim to speak about God must always respect the a priority of silence. We rise from silence, we return to silence. And so all that we say is a few waves in that ocean, which begins with quietude and returns to quietude. Nevertheless, having to say something, I will try to make a few comments upon God, who is not at any place or any time, who transcends all times and all places, but nevertheless, who is present at all times and all spaces. If Rabbi Kushner thought that God at 2000 was a website address. Since I've never done any surfing except in the ocean, I don't know what surfing is, thank God, and I hope I'll die and don't find out. So it has nothing to do with me. When I received this, my office in Washington happens to be on the 21st Street and H, and 2 blocks away is 2000 Pennsylvania Avenue, which is a series of shops and mall where I usually go for lunch, and they have concerts and all kinds of things, and next to it is the White House, 2 blocks down. And when I read this, I said, surely God will not descend upon the White House, and it must be upon 2000 Pennsylvania Avenue by mistake. But of course, God is not at any at, and this is only a metaphorical way of expressing it. All that has been ever said about God by those who have ever experienced God is always valid. That's again why Rabbi Kushner said the old lies are all true. Of course, they were not lies. We thought they were lies. The experience of humanity, of the divine, is something that participates in the immutability of the divine nature and the permanence of a relationship which really transcends time. The expressions are different, yes, but they always meet in the deepest sense in a level which transcends all becoming. So what I have to say to you in this, drawn essentially from, since I was instructed not to speak as a theologian or philosopher, but from an experiential point of view, from my own humble marching upon or struggling upon the path of reaching the divine, having studied both theologically and philosophically many different texts concerning divine reality, how I believe that the divine reality presents itself to us now, in a now which has always been and always will be, but nevertheless with applications which our own circumstances call for. First of all, the Islamic distinction between the necessity of the fear of God, the love of God, and the knowledge of God, I've found to be most abiding and absolutely essential. There's something in us which has to fear God, but the fear of God is different from the fear of men. The great Islamic theologian Ghazali said the difference between God and his creatures is that when you fear the creature, you run away from it. When you fear God, you run towards him. It is this fear that is absolutely essential. It is this fear to which St. Paul referred, to which the Old Testament refers, to which the Quran refers. There's something in us that has to shrivel before the divine reality, before we expand. And therefore, the element of fear, which then is expressed in the life of religion as the service of God, is the beginning of all things. Rasul hikmah makhafatullah, the famous Arabic saying goes, that is the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, which is almost identical with the Pauline dictum. Now, how that expresses itself in our daily life of the quest for God, in the tradition from which I come, means most of all surrender. Surrender to the will of God, which is so difficult, and yet when one succeeds, so sweet. There's one moment in life when we shall all surrender to God. That is when we die, when a will transcends our will. And happy is the person who has already experienced that now. This is the secret of the saying of the Prophet of Islam, die before you die. Mutu qabla an tamutu, which is very interestingly paraphrased by Angelus Silesius in a 17th century German poem, whether Anna Maria Schimmel thinks it was influenced by Sufi poetry, it may be just a rediscovery of this very profound truth. In any case, that is the experience of what one might call initiatic spiritual death, which is also so much emphasized in the Christian tradition in many, many different ways, and among the mystics, in the Jewish tradition, the Kabbalah, many different traditions, in the beginning of the Buddhist path. This death means essentially the surrender of our will to God and experiencing now of what will finally all of us experience at the moment of death. And to be able to surrender one's will to God turns even the adversities of life into sweetness. But it's a very difficult thing to achieve. Very, very difficult thing to achieve. God has at once given us the freedom to rebel against Him, and the love and attraction that wants us to give up this freedom to surrender to Him. And this is the grandeur of the human state. That is why we're made in the image of God. We share in both God's freedom and necessity in a certain sense, which no other creature does. All other creatures are very fortunate in a sense that they're all good Muslims without having to do anything. They're all surrendered to God. Muslim means to be surrendered to God. When the Quran says Abraham was a Muslim, Musliman Hanifan, it meant that he has surrendered to God. And the very word Islam, which in English is used for the Islamic religion, has two meanings in Islam itself. One means the specifically Quranic revelation of the 7th century, the religion to which over 1 billion people belong today. It also, in a more universal sense, means surrender to God. So all creatures, in a sense, are Muslim. It is we who have this remarkable opportunity, at the same time danger of rebellion, given the freedom that we have. And of course, to this is related the whole question of the origin of evil, to which I shall come back later. Then, once this surrender takes place, with this comes love, the love of God. Many missionaries used to write in the 19th century that Islam has no conception of the love of God. There are books after books after books written which fill up the whole of the Widener Library on this issue. Of course, it is to totally misunderstand the whole situation. That is why many people thought, since Sufism spoke so much about love, it had to come from somewhere else. It could not be Islamic. Whereas one of the 99 names of God is Al-Wudud, love, or the lover. And the name Habib, the word which Hafiz used, which is also the name of the Prophet of Islam, is also the name of God, that is the friend, the lover. In fact, in Islam, the saint is called Waliullah, that is the friend of God, or Muhib, the lover of God. All of these terms are very, very common in Islamic parlance. Anyway, there is no possibility of the love of God without the realization of the majesty of God. And this love must be such that all loves are dissolved in it. A spiritual person, man or woman, cannot love anything except in God. And that is the condition for realizing the divine, to be able to realize that all love is ultimately the love of God. Not only the love of God for us, who are us, ultimately the love of God for His own theophany, of which we happen to be one. And therefore, in a sense, it's the love of the divine for that which is the greatest object of love, which is the divine itself. And we are, in fact, the channel through which this love passes. And finally, the knowledge of God. Now, knowledge has been so emptied of its spiritual content that today, when we talk about the knowledge of God, it seems very ambivalent. My Gifford lectures, Knowledge and Sacred, was devoted to the whole question of trying to resacralize the act of knowing. In the traditions like Islam and Hinduism, especially these two traditions which speak so much of this, and also certain forms of Buddhism, and of course in medieval Judaism and the Kabbalistic tradition of Spain and other places, knowledge itself is a sacred activity. It is inseparable from the sacred. To know, ultimately, is to know God. We can know nothing in essence without knowing God in it. And the supreme goal of all knowledge is the knowledge of that reality which alone knows, which is God. Now, this kind of knowledge is not conceptual knowledge. It is not rationalistic knowledge, although reason itself is a ray of the divine intellect in us. It is ultimately the knowledge of that divine spark within us of God. That is, to know God is to allow the God within to know God. That is why in Islam, the Gnostic, the highest level, a person who knows God, is called Al-Arifu Billah, that is the person who knows by God. We can only know God by God. But that should be the goal of all knowledge, as it was in fact in all the great traditions, including the Christian tradition, before knowledge became secularized in the 17th century with the scientific revolution, and before that with nominalism in the 14th century, which was really the swan song of Christian philosophy and gradually prepared the ground for the secularization of thinking, of thought. So when I talk about knowledge, of course, it doesn't mean this conceptual separative knowledge, which is always based, especially since Descartes in the West, on the bifurcation between the subject and the object. Whether it's science, philosophy, anthropology, psychology, we're always stuck with this theory of bifurcation, which nobody dares criticize. But principial knowledge is, in a miraculous way, transcends the dichotomy between the knower and the known. It is the unity of knower and being, of the knower and being, of the subject and the object, in a unity which is incomprehensible to conceptualize, precisely because conceptualization belongs to the realm of the separation of this unity into the knower and the known. Now, this hierarchy in the path of knowing God has led, I don't even want to say me, but those who, like myself, have tread upon this path, to certain assertions about the nature of divine reality, which I said, being atemporal, are at 2,000 and would be at 3,000 if we don't destroy the world and last another 1,000 years, at any moment of time. First of all, a fundamental assertion that God is one. Now, many people who do not know Christian theology well, and this has been done by many missionaries in the 19th century, think this is a kind of pleonasm. Why does Islam and Judaism always emphasize that God is one? So what? We all know that. Why are you talking about something which is obvious? Actually, this is much more profound than simply the assertion that there are not two bearded judges sitting in heaven. It's not that at all. It may begin with that, because in the same way that our understanding of everything in society, everything, goes from a simple understanding to profound understanding. You listen to a little minuet of Mozart. I would understand in one way, Bruno Walters would understand another way. In the same way, there are those for whom, simple people, at least, it prevents the error of considering two sources for things. But for the person who knows, the oneness of God is the way of integration of ourselves. The word tawheed in Arabic, which is used for oneness, which is like the alpha and omega of everything Islamic, does not only mean one, but is also the act of making one. It is integration. So the oneness of God is a statement not only about the nature of the divine reality, but about the interrelatedness of all things and the integration of ourselves. Not only are we related to all things, as it was said yesterday by Professor Borg and Rabbi Kushner and others, but also that interrelatedness is the consequence of divine unity. If there were more than one divine origin for creation, there would not be this interrelatedness. I mean, logically, it would make no sense. All of these scientists running havoc, trying to find anti-universes and so forth to explain a few equations, which, of course, these will go out of fashion in 10 years, and you can think of something else. But all of this is, in a way, because they don't have the metaphysical insight, the metaphysical background. There cannot be two sources to reality. And since God is one, its implication for us is that, first of all, we have to be one. We are really a house divided unto ourselves. And as Christ said, that house does not stand. We do not act from a single center. Our mind is scattered, our emotions go in different directions, our actions do not always originate from the same source. Life is a program for integration. Today, everybody talks about integral studies. Integration has become a very common, popular word, but metaphysically, that is the consequence of the oneness of God. We will never understand the oneness of God in itself, only God understands that. But to assert that is to understand what we should be doing. So one consequence is the integration of ourselves, and the second is the realization of the interrelatedness of all things. All the traditional cosmologies, I've written a great deal about Islamic cosmology and science, and a little bit about other traditional cosmologies, always assert that things are interrelated. We had to wait for the massacre of nature at the end of the 20th century to say, oh yes, things are interrelated. People lived for 100,000 years believing that, otherwise we would not be around to be able to cut the trees in Oregon. The fact that we can cut the trees is that the Indians for 40,000 years didn't cut them. And because they based themselves on a view in which they saw the integration, interrelatedness of all things. So the oneness of God, far from being a pleonasm, is the cardinal central doctrine which determines who we are, what should we do in this life, and how this should be related to other creatures. Now, I know there are certain Christian theologians, some of my good friends, who reject the Islamic and Jewish views and say that God cannot be understood outside of the Trinity. That I understand. But also, of course, in the Catholic credo, credo in Deum Unum, you believe in a single God. I believe in a single God. And that is not, I think, negated. The fact that you have the Trinitarian doctrine does not negate the unity of God. And I think there are many Muslim theologians who criticize Christians wrongly on that issue because they didn't really understand that the Christian Trinity did not negate the divine oneness. And that had a lot to do with the type of Trinitarianism, tathlith, which Islam faced in the Oriental churches, and all of those things that were going on with the Monophysites and Nestorians and all kinds of things like that. Now, in addition to being one, God has certain cataphatic virtues, that is, certain qualities about which we can speak, all of which must be understood symbolically. I do not use the word metaphorically. A metaphor is not a symbol. It must be understood symbolically, in the real sense of the symbol. First of all, God is absolute. I know that in modern philosophy you don't use this term anymore, except the modern philosophical view itself considers to be itself absolute, but that doesn't talk about that. Otherwise, you don't talk about it. Like saying everything is relative except the statement I'm making, that's absolute. And that's the very paradox of this kind of relativism. But I don't care what this kind of philosophy says. 10 years down the road, we finished with something else. According to perennial philosophy, God is the absolute. What does that mean? When that God whom Moses heard on top of Mount Sinai, who spoke to the prophet, who spoke to Christ in the desert, that is God is absolute. This absoluteness, metaphysically, means that it excludes all that is other than it, that it has no division within itself. There is nothing in it that is not completely there. It is what the Buddhists would call suchness, in a complete different context of a non-theistic world. That is what suchness is, that which is complete suchness in itself. But God is also infinite. That is infinite in the sense that every possibility that you conceive is already contained in the divine reality. It is not a place where I can go more deeply theologically and philosophically into this, but just remember that the word potentiality, which we use, and in Catholic theology, God is pure act, you go from potentiality to act, is related itself to the Latin word posse and the word possibility. And therefore, all that can be actualized must already be in the divine all possibility. That's what the divine infinitude is. And this aspect of divine reality in the West has been best dealt with by the Kabbalistic metaphysicians, really, more than anyone else. But it also, of course, is discussed by certain Christian metaphysicians. And God is perfection. God is the perfect good. Now, the reason I mentioned these three cardinal, you might say, qualification of divine, which goes back to the writings of Friedrich Schwann, I owe him that, is that it explains so much, not only the nature of the divine, but also in relation to us. First of all, the root of gender distinctions is in the divine reality itself. When the Quran says God created all things in pairs, and so does the Bible, it means that the male-female difference, not only the human order, but in animals and even the inanimate world, in the fact that the electromagnetic wave has two different poles, or the electric wave has plus and minus, is this polarity, this duality, which on the human plane and the biological plane presents itself as the complementarity of the two sexes. This has its root in the divine nature. In a sense, the absolute is the origin of the masculine principle and the infinite of the feminine principle. And the feminine principle always in the divine has the aspect of interiority, inwardness. It is interesting that all of the major words which express in Arabic the aspect of divine mercy which manifests the world are feminine, like ar-Rahmah, the divine mercy, is always in the feminine form. And it's for this reason that Sufi metaphysics has developed a very elaborate, what you would call today, a feminine theology. And that's why Islam is not at all bothered by all this change of language and gender and all these things that are going on in the West. It does nothing new. Arabic is a language which has both male and female conjugation, gender, in its verbs as well as noun, and the Quran always makes use of both when addressing both sexes, and Islamic metaphysics has given a very elaborate description of how the divine reality must contain at once the feminine and the masculine. As for perfection, Islam shares, of course, with Christianity, Judaism, and all religions that only the good is the good, and only my Father in heaven is the good, as Christ said. And therefore, God is the perfect good. And that is the explanation also why there is evil in the world. If God is the only good, and we are not God, we cannot be completely good. There must be evil. Evil is the hiatus, separation of us from God. If we were already in God, there would be no evil. We are both in God and separated from Him. And this separation is the philosophical, metaphysical explanation for the origin of evil. Evil is separation from the good, as Dante says so beautifully in the Divine Comedy. Now, God is at once, from what I've said, it should be clear, at once the transcendent and the immanent. God is totally other and totally here. And I said already, a serious seeker of the spiritual life, a one who really seeks after God, his or her life will be kind of like a pendular motion between these two poles. It is impossible to reach God as the immanent without God the transcendent. That is one of the great errors of our times. It's too easy. We don't do anything. You just all become St. Francis of Assisi without doing anything. You just go to a few self-realization centers and you see God everywhere and you think that's it. That is not it. One has to realize the transcendence of the divine and nothingness before the divine before realizing the proximity of the divine. But this remarkable mystery of both nearness and farness is, I think, sort of the pulse of the spiritual life for those who are in quest of God, at least in the tradition to which I belong. In Islam, it is not God who is veiled from us. It is we who are veiled from God. God is not a mystery. We are the mystery. If we could only overcome ourselves, we would reach the reality, but we are veiled from God. The veil, in a sense, is put on this side rather than on that side. And there are very many poems, beautiful Persian, Arabic poems. I don't want to take time to read any poems for you, any more poems for you. And coming back to the verse of the Quran, that we are very close to God. But what wonder that we are so far away. And the real understanding of that metaphysically is the following. And I shall end my discourse with that shortly, but I just want to allude to it. We are veiled from God precisely because of that proximity. Precisely because of that proximity. If God were only absent, we would have a feeling of that absence. But it's a combination of absence and presence, which for a person in a state of unconsciousness spiritually makes God to be unreal. And I shall come back to that soon. In the same way, God is at once personal and impersonal. In English, I know there are some Muslims who do not want to translate the word Allah into God. I am not one of them. I agree fully with what Professor X said yesterday, that when you translate from one religion to another, it's not like translating some text on sociology and somebody reads it in English, somebody's translating to German. I agree with that. You cannot translate Vishnu or Durga immediately into some Christian term without causing somewhat of a distortion. But when it comes to Islam and Christianity, being the main religion of the West, and therefore all languages of the West being influenced by the Christian view of the divinity, I think the word Allah should certainly be translated as God, provided that this word is not seen in a privative sense as excluding the Godhead, the Ungrund of Meister Eckhart, the divine ground. And why should it? Why should it? It's true that the German mystics distinguish between Gott and Gottheit, but the word Gott in German or God or Dieu in French is universal enough to encompass what we mean by Allah. And it's interesting that the Christians whose mother tongue is Arabic, many people in Oregon might not know that there are millions of Christians who go to church not only Sundays, every day, and listen to the Arabic Mass. They always use the word Allah for God. I mean, if you go to a Coptic church in Cairo or to an Orthodox church in Lebanon and sit down and they're using Arabic, you will hear the word Allah. So I think we should translate Allah as God. Remembering, however, to put aside the privative aspects of it. We cannot reduce God to only the Trinitarian relationship, otherwise you can translate Allah as God. And even more important metaphysically is not to forget that although God is the person towards us as the face is turned towards us, His reality is infinitely more than that. The Ein Sof is not only the face of God towards us. So God is at once impersonal and personal. And impersonal here is not a privation, believe you me. Because how else can I try to convince you? Because God loves, God is person, but also God is like a placid lake, and we are like snowflakes gradually falling upon that lake. And when you reach that level, you dissolve in that lake. You don't have to worry about person and I and thou. That is, God is thou, but there's always that aspect of divinity which is transpersonal, is beyond the person. And this is, I think, the key, metaphysically speaking, for the monotheistic religions to understand those religions which have a non-personal view of the divinity. The Tao in Taoism, in Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, and Buddhism, especially these three great religions of Asia, not to talk of Shintoism and the shamanic religions. In those religions, you have all of the spirituality, all of the ethics, everything looks like us, prayers, and they don't seem to be praying to anybody. There's no God. What are they doing? It isn't that there's no God. It is that God, in the personal sense, appears in a different way in that cosmos. In that, as Maitreya or someone like that, but the Buddha nature, just to speak about Buddhism, the state of nirvana, in a sense, is the subjective pole of the impersonal divinity. Anyway, God, in His infinitude and absoluteness, includes the personal, but is not only bound to the personal, because that would make Him non-infinite. That would already relativize God. So we take nothing away by considering the fact that God is both the face that He has turned towards us and infinitely beyond that, by the nature of His infinity. There's a whole metaphysics that can be developed on that, but I will not go into it. And finally, as far as these points are concerned, I want to emphasize again that there is such a thing as the science of God. I've tried to now resuscitate this Latin term, scientia sacra. I've written a book called The Need for Sacred Science, which caused a great deal of commotion when it first came out, but now gradually many people are paying attention to what I'm saying. That is, we have reduced in the West metaphysics to a branch of philosophy. The science of gnosis, which is still used in the Eastern Orthodox Church in a respectable way, because of Gnosticism and all those things that occurred in the 3rd and 4th centuries in the West, is not easily acceptable. Although Père de Lubac, von Balthasar, some of the Catholic theologians of the 20th century have tried to resuscitate the term gnosis. But there's no good term in the English language for the science of God. Every great civilization, religious civilization, has always had a theology, a philosophy, and that science of God, which you could call gnosis, theosophy, whatever you like, or metaphysics. But all of these have been fractured in modern European languages because of the historical experience. But there is such a science. This is the supreme science. If you were a Hindu or a Muslim, you would know that immediately. That is the supreme science, the science of the real. And I believe that our approach towards God, as this new millennium begins, must be to once again take seriously in the West the possibility of the knowledge of God through a science which is neither philosophy nor theology as ordinarily understood. I don't mean original or something like that, ordinary theology, but which nevertheless is a science of the real, a science of the divine. Of course, if that were to occur, it would affect everything else. All of our other disciplines, it would affect a whole university education. But until we get to that, at least let's try to pay attention to this. Now, to reach God, to try to reach God, to try to swim in that ocean of oneness, is to also realize that the divine nature, because of its infinitude and its goodness, has created the world. We have to somehow explain the relationship between God and transience, God and history, God and time. This is more on an external plane, the role of the theologian and the philosopher. The person in quest of God, the woman or man in quest of God, is not really interested in developing a whole philosophy of history a la Hegel or somebody else on what is time and so forth. He wants, in fact, to reach God, or she wants to reach God. Nevertheless, I believe that as a result of the historicism which has become prevalent since the 18th century, and especially in the 19th century in Europe and later on in America, many people have come to confuse the moving image of the manifestations of God with God himself, the divine reality itself. And I think it is very important to realize that God, while being immutable, is also, of course, the source of all that exists in time. But we cannot imprison the divine reality in time. I always try to distinguish between the historical and the historial. We've reduced too much everything to the historical. Anything which is not historical is unreal for us. In a sense, we have negated the plane of permanence in favor of the plane of transience. We are only interested in the transient. And that, when it reaches its nth degree, its limit, becomes what we are in right now. Already the 1970s are like pharaonic Egypt. You know, it's so far back, nobody cares. When in the 1990s, people said, this is the 90s. Now 2 and 2 must be 6 or something like that. Now already the 90s are gone. We do what I call the absolutization of the transient. That's become our habit in modern, especially in America, American culture. We take our own times too seriously because we've lost the vision of that which transcends time. And the quest for God always necessitates being able to take a step away from the stream of transience. Otherwise, you would have no monasticism in Christianity, no inner disciplines in Islam and Sufism, although Islam does not have monasticism, and equivalent institutions and means of, in a sense, pulling yourself out for a while out of that stream in order to realize the permanent and then see the permanent manifested in the stream. But if you're only swimming in the stream, you'll never be able to see how the permanent manifests itself in it. And this brings me to the part of the end of my discourse, the question of how God manifests its reality in transience, in the world of time and space in which we live. We begin our ordinary consciousness with things, objects, peoples, things which are around us, either human beings, cat, door, little child sees various things. Spiritual growth is to gradually, step by step, realize that, first of all, on the first stage, that all things come from God. Then to realize that all things return to God. And most importantly, that all things are the manifestation of some aspect of the divine reality. That is, in the sage, the spiritual person has realized God, for him or her, everything is a theophany. Nature was the primordial revelation of God, now forgotten by us. It's a divine revelation, like the sacred scriptures. God's primordial revelation. The Quran oftentimes speaks about that very explicitly. That was God's first revelation. If you understand the book of Genesis correctly, that's what it means. God created the world in the same way that he sent the Decalogue to Moses. And therefore, religion is not only for us, but in the deepest sense for the whole of the cosmos. The whole of the cosmos has its own religion in the deepest sense. And therefore, gradually we grow to realize that everything is a theophany. You can see God upon the face of all things. There's a saying of the Prophet of Islam that says, God has written the mark of beauty upon all things. كتب الله الإحسان على كل شيء. This is used, of course, also in Islamic art, but for the spiritual person, it means the realization that everything bears the imprint of God. The reason we cannot see it is because of the problems we have with our eyes, not because it is not there. And this is most importantly for our day. is to apply this to two worlds in which we didn't have to do this before. For thousands of years when human beings lived, they did not have to concern themselves with other religions. One religion is enough, in a certain sense. If you live one religion fully, understand it fully, it will take many, many lifetimes. I mean a living, authentic religion, I don't mean a dead religion, but the great traditional religions which have survived over the centuries and millennia in our world. Since I don't play cards, I don't use the metaphor of cards, but I would say yesterday, the deck contains all the cards. I don't even know how many cards there are in a deck, but I trust what Rabbi Kushner said. But, that is the various possibilities exist within the great religions of the world. But we never had to concern ourselves with it. The fact that a young woman from Montana has to go to Benares would not have occurred even in the 18th century. And if she did, like some English woman, her soul would be close to that Benares. Her inner space was still too much filled with the Christian religion to have to bother with what the Hindus were saying. She might write a tourist guide or a little diary to send back home or something like that. Now this is something which we have to contend with. I've always said this is the only new thing under the sun. Only new, exciting, really exciting, new intellectual venture of contemporary man is the discovery of other spiritual and religious universes without losing our own mooring, without falling down and relativizing everything. So this is a kind of new application of the perennial awareness of the ubiquitous manifestation of divine reality. In a more concrete sense, every religion is a face that God has turned to a particular humanity. And within that humanity is able to realize its own telos, its own purpose, its own end for which we were all created. And secondly, the cosmos, the world of nature. We all know that if we don't change radically our way of living, everything else will be trivial because we will not be around to talk about it. The environmental crisis cannot be solved with cosmetics. It needs a very profound transformation of ourselves, of who we are, what is the world of nature, what rights do we have, what rights does the world of nature have. It makes all the difference in the world. If you look at a redwood and see this as a theophany of God, or if you see the amount of wood to be sold on the market until we'll see what will happen next year and we'll think of something else. This whole way that has been created in the modern world, and now the rest of the globe is following, unfortunately, the example that Western Europe and the United States are setting, that is of simply considering the world of nature as commodity, as being something for the economic life. That must go. Just 10 days ago, I participated in the 2 weeks ago in the inaugural session of the World Economic Forum in Davos. And they asked me and Umberto Eco and 2 or 3 other people what we thought were the 2 most important issues and problems for the coming century. And I spoke about the importance of relation between civilizations in a deeper sense, at the heart of which was religion, and secondly, taking the environmental crisis seriously. And honest to God, I was thinking of Oregon at that time, because in my youth, I'd oftentimes traveled in these redwood forests, which are no longer here. And I said that in the 21st century, either economics as a separate discipline and a separate science will be banned, or there'll be no 22nd century. It's one of these two. And why this has this happened? Because we've taken off the hands of God from His creation. We have refused to realize that nature is a sacred trust in our hands. It is not simply an it, and we are not the only creatures in the world. God is not only our God, is not only the God of all humanity, is the God of all of creation. The little mollusk, little fish swimming, little flower blooming are also God's creatures. By what right do we decimate them? By what right are we destroying the species to such an extent that just during this 2-day conference, several hundred species will have disappeared from the face of the earth? Now, to know God in our time means also to pay attention to this. In the old days, Saint Francis, the patron saint of the Catholic Church of ecology, lived in Tuscany at a time when there was no great danger to the trees and the birds and the animals of Tuscany. He didn't have to bother with that. So while he spoke about the love of the birds, he did not have to apply that as a living theology, living philosophy to the world in which we live. I believe today that anyone who speaks about God must be aware that he must be also protector of God's theophanies, which is the world of nature. And that is extremely crucial for our survival. Now, finally, at the end, the goal of approaching God is to see God everywhere, to hear the voice of God everywhere. Of course, after you listen to the Sanctus of B minor Mass of Johann Sebastian Bach, I don't think I have to say anything. That is, I think, considered the greatest work of Western sacred music since the Renaissance. Unbelievable work. That is the voice of God in music. But we must be able to hear it everywhere. We must be able to see God everywhere. And on the highest level, the supreme goal of realization is to realize that only God is. The foundation, the heart of the Islamic religion is the saying, La ilaha illallah. That is usually translated, there is no God but God. The first with a small g, the second with a capital G. Or sometimes even no God but God, because the Arabic has no verb in it. There's no copula in Arabic. It's unnecessary to relate the subject and predicate with a verb, but the copula is. So even the verb to be does not appear. It's a fundamental, primordial assertion of Islam. Now, each person understands this according to his or her own degree of understanding the religion. But the highest level, for those in search of God, means that there is no reality but God. Only God is, and we are to the extent that we are aware of this reality. He or she who is not aware of this reality, we are really non-existent, appearing in the guise of existence. To fully be is to realize that only God is. There is a verse of the Quran with which I want to conclude, a very enigmatic and difficult verse to understand, over which commentators have debated over centuries. Is outwardly very simple. And with the comment upon this verse, I wish to conclude. The Quran says God is al-awwalu wal-akhiru wal-dhahiru wal-batin. That is, God is the first and the last, the outward and the inward. If we're ready to understand that, we'll understand everything. God is the first. Every Christian, remember the saying of Christ, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. Then the Greek alphabet means the first letter of the alphabet, the last letter, and the beginning and the end. So God is the origin of all things. We all issue from God. God is the last, al-akhir. We all return back to God, not only us, but all of creation, whether we like it or not. Jalaluddin Rumi in a beautiful poem says, look, you have to follow this path back to God. Why not walk upon it with a smile by your own will, rather than having your hair taken and being pulled on this path? We all return back to God. He is the inward. In fact, the life of a spiritual is the life of inwardness, to live inwardly and to see things inwardly. But most difficult of all is also the outward. It's the text of the Quran for Muslims, sacred scripture. How can God be the outward? Here's the outward. Where is God? And here's where that great mystery lies. We think that we should be able to see God like I'm seeing you. Whereas in fact, God is the light of our eye with which we see. And how can we ever see with the light of the eye, with something which itself is the way by which we see things? So it is not an object that the eye sees, it is the light of the eye with which one sees. And if one realizes that whether we like it or not, we live within, it's like the cross, the four corners of the cross, within these four words, four names of God. We originate from God, we return to God. The inner aspect of all things is God, and the outer aspect of all things is God. And happy is the person who, before the moment comes when we have to really surrender ourselves to God's will, realizes this truth. Thank you. barakatuh.